Hi, I'm Dick Berner. I teach finance at NYU Stern and co-direct the NYU Stern Volatility and Risk Institute, or VRI. At the VRI, we focus on assessing several areas of risk, including today's topic, cyber and operational risk. Cyber events and cyber crimes have multiplied recently and threaten the viability of companies and the economy. We're very fortunate in today's podcast to have with us a real expert in the field. Judy Germano is a nationally recognized thought leader on cybersecurity governance and privacy issues. She's a distinguished fellow at the NYU Center for Cybersecurity, or CCS, and NYU Center on Law and Security, or CLS, and an adjunct professor of law at the NYU School of Law. Judy leads the CCS Cybersecurity Task Force and roundtable series of corporate executives and senior government officials addressing critical cybersecurity concerns. Judy's a practicing lawyer at Germano Law, LLC. She advises public and privately held companies on cybersecurity and privacy matters, and representing companies and individuals on securities fraud and other complex white-collar criminal and regulatory compliance issues. Judy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dick. It's great to be here.
So I'm going to start with some pretty basic questions, although they may not have simple answers. The most recent cyber crimes, including those affecting the Colonial Pipeline, JBS, and Kaseya, among others, involve ransomware, or a type of malware that threatens to publish or blocks access to data or a computer system, usually by encrypting it until the victim pays a ransom fee to the attacker. So please tell us what happened in those cases and where the vulnerabilities were.
Well, we've been talking about the concern of ransomware for more than the last couple of years, and it continues to grow in terms of scope and potential damage. And what we've seen in those three examples that you just mentioned, with Kaseya, with Colonial Pipeline, and with JBS, the meat producer, but we have seen that the amount that criminals are seeking for ransom is higher and higher. And we've also seen that no longer are ransomware attackers going after smaller organizations, but they're looking at bigger targets. They're hitting bigger targets that can create widespread harm. 50% of meat production in the United States, major fuel pipeline, where fuel pipelines had to be shut down in the East Coast, causing a concern and lack of access. And now with Kaseya, a software provider that helps smaller and mid-sized businesses manage their IT and security, cutting them off and reaching potentially 1,500 different victims is a really serious concern as well.
So Judy, do we know who did it?
Well, the Kaseya attack has been attributed to REVIL, R-E-V-I-L, a Russian-based cyber criminal organization. Law enforcement has been working with international partnerships and doing great work to identify for each of the different attacks. One of the big problems we have, though, is that often the cyber criminals are outside the reach of US law enforcement. So for that, you may rely on international collaboration and other things to sometimes have to wait till they travel to a place where they can be arrested or apprehended, which doesn't always happen, as you know.
Sure. So what are the motives of these criminals? Is it just money in the case of ransomware? Do we know how, who got how much, apart from the widely publicized figure of $11 million at JBS? And are there other motives?
There are other motives. Traditionally, I think that we saw ransomware as a means of making money, seizing up systems, requiring a payment, grabbing data from the systems, requiring a payment. Otherwise, the data would be released, the systems would not be unlocked. But we also worry when you see attacks as sophisticated as the ones of recent history, as in just the past week. We really worry also how many of these attackers are potentially working for other purposes. And we've also seen significant reports of how it's become quite an enterprise operation. So there are specialists who can gain access to different systems and networks who then sell that access, which may be selling it to nation states, it may be selling it to fraudsters seeking to make money or other criminals seeking to get rich. And different people along the cybercrime chain are involved in these attacks, which makes it more multi-layered in terms of just saying one motive or another. And it also makes it harder for law enforcement because there are different operators within the enterprise who may not even know each other. And so you have to work through that whole chain, which is not a linear chain, but rather a multi-dimensional enterprise of criminals involved at different steps of an attack.
Sounds like a Rubik's Cube. So you've described something that's very complicated and not completely within the reach of sort of local authorities, obviously. So what remedies exist for combating these kinds of crimes?
Well, again, also multi-layered. The step one for organizations is the importance of having good cybersecurity in place and a constant vigilance. There are numerous attacks on a regular basis, and one slip up, the attackers can get in, systems and data can be compromised. So having efforts to stop that, and then also to detect it and being poised to respond quickly and appropriately. But that alone is not enough. You also want to have pre-existing relationships with law enforcement that you can call, and that's from the organizational perspective. And then for our government, the question is, how much can they do, and are they doing? And it's very difficult. There are very talented people in law enforcement working on investigating the problem, and people elsewhere in the government working on sharing information, but a lot more work needs to be done in that way, in that area. And international relationships and collaboration, we've had some great success, but there's also more to be done there, for sure.
Yeah. Well, in terms of cyber crimes in general, are the criminals liable for prosecution?
Yes, if it's under US law, unauthorized access to a protected computer, extortion in the case of ransomware, and other crimes, they are certainly liable for prosecution under our laws in the United States. The big trick is, or the big challenge, I should say, is identifying them, the attribution of the crime, and then if the perpetrators are in the US, which often we see they are not.
Yeah, I saw the former ambassador to Russia on a news program, I guess last night, saying, the president should identify these people as criminals and kind of put the ball in Russia's court in terms of, forcing them to do something about it. Whether that will have results or not remains to be seen. But what about early warning? You mentioned that we've discovered in the past few days that the Kaseya issue was maybe a little less of a surprise to some people than earlier thought?
Well, we're still, the timeline is still developing and becoming apparent, but what we understand is that a security research firm identified seven different vulnerabilities, zero-day vulnerabilities. So they were not already known.
What's a zero-day vulnerability for the layperson?
So a vulnerability that is detected and not previously known. So so in that kind of case, there usually is not an existing patch for the vulnerability. And having a patch can sometimes take time to develop to fully understand how to stop the problem. And we understand the security research firm reached out to Kaseya, who they said were very responsive, and they were working collaboratively to address the problems. And in fact, Kaseya had put out not one, but two different patches addressing some of the vulnerabilities. But unfortunately, before this attack happened, the system was compromised. And I understand as of today, the CEO had announced that there would be a patch coming out on July 11th. But again, it just shows that a patch may not be instantaneous. The process is really important, but I do from what I've seen and read from the outside, it does appear that Kaseya has been very responsible in terms of working with the security research firm to address the problem quickly, taking accountability for what was happening, and then hitting a point where they realized this is such a big problem, we have to shut it down, and pulling the plug as they did, to shut off the systems because of the attacks as they were occurring. And I read in one place it was within an hour that they responded. And those are not always easy decisions to make. In hindsight, sometimes it's easier to look back and say, oh, why did they do it this way and that way? But in the fog of a real-time security incident and response, it's not always so clear.
So just to me, that suggests that there are a number of ways that we can think about building resilience. You talked a little bit about what we often refer to as cyber hygiene among firms. And what you were just talking about suggests that maybe doing tabletop exercises or war games so that people know who to call and know which playbook to pull out, in the fog of war, if you will. They know what to do and they've rehearsed it, and they can be better prepared. Is that one of the aspects of building resilience for firms?
Yes, that's very important, to practice the responsive muscle for an attack. And the other thing that happens often through the briefings and the testings that are done during the course of not an incident response, but proactively, is you find where certain vulnerabilities are. And I don't mean just technological vulnerabilities. I mean vulnerabilities in the governance system, who's in charge at the organization, what budgetary spend is already contemplated and put in place in advance, who's going to report to the CEO and to the board when, what is the making sure the organization has hold statements prepared, and who's going to be making those statements depending on the type of incident. All of those things can be discussed and vetted and contemplated in advance and help in responding to an attack. And then in the case of ransomware, it's important to get a sense among the executives, the stakeholders, the board, of what's the organization's posture on that, because it can be very different. For example, hospitals have been hit with ransomware and lives are at stake there, versus other organizations that have said, we can operate on paper for a period of time and rebuild, we're not paying anything. Colonial Pipeline made the decision to pay $4.4 million in ransomware because they felt that they could not continue without doing that. The government was able to get $2 million of that back by tracing the cryptocurrency. And we also saw, as you mentioned, Dick, that JBS, the meat provider, paid $11 million in ransom.
Right. So it sounds like there's an issue of misaligned incentives, if you will, because you want to get things up and running. People will say, well, it's a cost of doing business. On the other hand, the more that you pay people for these ransomware attacks, the more it emboldens them to launch more attacks, right? How do we fix that?
Well, that's the importance really of resiliency and business continuity. So for certain organizations that are hit with ransomware, they can just switch over to backup systems. You want to make sure, of course, that those backups are not also corrupted and that the backups are in fact functioning. There have been organizations that have their backups so linked that the malware that struck the systems are then also hitting the backups. And there have been organizations that when they go to the backups, first of all, they don't know exactly where they are or how to get them running, or they're not for a sufficient period of time, or that you just want to make sure that they're in fact backing up. That's happened as well, where the organization thought it had backups but hadn't tested those. So those need to be checked. And then also, we want to be aware. For example, last October 2020, the OCC issued a warning that it could be an OFAC violation if you pay ransomware in certain countries and to certain designated individuals. And in a ransomware attack, you don't always know who you're paying. And it's not only for the victims paying the ransom, but also facilitators and banks who are involved in those transactions. So that's a government concern, a way to try to stop the problem of this self-perpetuating paying ransom encourages more to pay ransom. But there really are some entities that feel that have made a decision that they don't have another choice but to pay. And
Right.
that's really the problem.
Right. So speaking of government, what can the U.S. and other governments do? You alluded to this earlier, to build more resilience against these kinds of attacks.
So I think that we need to have this conversation more and more at an international level in terms of collaboration. I would hope that we could come to some norms and agreements, but I'm admittedly a little bit discouraged in that happening, seeing how many attacks have been on hospitals and other really vulnerable situations, including a provider to small and mid-sized businesses for security and technology like Kaseya.
Yeah.
So we did have some success by analogy in the IP context, where President Obama signed an accord with the president of China that while nation states would be involved in certain activities, stealing intellectual property for financial gain was a crime that neither country would allow and would prosecute. For a period of time, that seemed to help with some limits. Perhaps if we could address something like that or explore something like that in terms of limits. I mean, all cybercrime is bad and should be addressed, but if there could be some effort in international norms and that the expectation that perhaps Russia is supporting and harboring and maybe encouraging these things should be addressed, and what agreements could be formed. And then to your question of what else could be done, I think that there are actions internationally in terms of cutting off the attackers and their modes. But the problem is that often they are using compromised systems of other victims to gain their access and commit their crimes. So it gets very tricky going down that path.
So you mentioned that in the I guess the Colonial Pipeline case, or maybe it was the JVS case, some of the payments were made in cryptocurrency. And that's not an area where we have a lot of financial regulation, at least not yet, although there's been a lot of talk about that. Could the government really start to come down, with better regulations to regulate that part of the payments mechanism? I mean, one of the appeals of Bitcoin clearly is that with its distributed ledger technology, you have some anonymity, but you mentioned that government was able to trace the wallets of some of these criminals and therefore recover some of the funds. What do we need to do in that area to help along this process?
In the area of digital currency, I think that the governments should recognize that there's a lot of good in that currency and that this is the technological reality and where we are. And so I would caution that it's important to understand sensible regulations that contemplate the currency and how it actually works, as opposed to, say, a knee-jerk reaction based on the fact of it being used by certain criminals. And we've seen some great success actually in the government's ability to trace Bitcoin in particular, but in the Colonial Pipeline case where they were able to get $2 million back. Also going back a few years in the Silk Road prosecution of the Dread Pirate Roberts, as he was called, they were able to trace Bitcoin that way as well. But I think one of the challenges is thinking about digital currency in a way that doesn't make sense under our existing legal framework, and instead stepping back to look at the laudable purposes of it, and internationally how it can facilitate transactions and exchange without exchange rates and other things, and come up with some sensible regulations that take that all into account.
No question about the fact that it would be great to be able to balance, innovation in finance along with sensible regulation that limits harm and limits the damage to both individuals and the system. So you're absolutely right. That sounds like the right way to proceed. What about insurance? If I'm a company that might be victimized by one of these incidents, can I buy insurance in advance against, this stuff? And does the insurance policy pay off the ransom?
Maybe and maybe. So yes, you can, but you have to see specifically what the policy is. But there are insurance companies that provide ransomware insurance, and you want to check what that is. There's been some criticism that and then some commendation. So take it as you will, but a concern, let's say, that the insurance companies have supported paying the ransom because it can be so much cheaper than the cost of rebuilding and restoring systems. But you also have to know, once you pay the ransom, you want to make sure the perpetrators are out of your system and the door is closed to your system.
Right.
So there's a lot of discussion, I think, still to be had regarding the insurance industry's role in, when we talk about ransomware in particular, in terms of a willingness to pay ransom versus rebuilding systems. But again, there are so many factors to take into account in terms of what's at stake, what are the harms of continued disruption. And I would hope that more and more funds would be allocated toward preventative measures in the upfront and toward best practices with insurance policies that could credit that kind of advanced spend in resilience and redundancy to better shore up against an attack, and basic practices to make sure that sensitive data is encrypted and the keys are kept separately. So if the ransomware attackers are siphoning data out of the system, which we've seen before they encrypt the system, and then threatening to release that data if the ransom isn't paid, there's at least some better protections on that.
So it's sort of like having a good driver discount for automobile insurance. If you take precautions, then you can buy the insurance on more attractive terms.
And that exists, but should be enhanced further.
Sure. I'm recalling that a little like a year and a half ago, back in the spring of 2020, we had a conference on cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and you were one of the moderators of a panel there. And we talked a lot about these issues. Then, we sort of knew that these issues were going to last, and I guess that was a little prophetic in the sense that we're experiencing a rash of these incidents now, and it's probably worth going back and remembering what we said back then, because I think there's still value in that. For the listener, you can find that on our website, the VRI website, and go to events and look up past conferences and see what we talked about at that conference. So, Judy, just to conclude a little bit, what do you think the lessons learned from all these ransomware attacks and cyber issues in general that we've been experiencing lately, in terms of what we need to do, both as businesses and individuals and as a society?
I think that the lessons are, it's a hard problem. It has to be a top priority. Companies are more often judged on their preparedness before an attack and how they respond to an attack than the fact of the attack itself, since it is so prevalent. So it's sort of a sense of it's happening to anyone, it could happen to anyone, but how you respond and what you've done to prepare, which then gives you a much better response indeed, is critical, which means you need to, as you mentioned, have the tabletop exercises, make sure that the board is regularly briefed on these issues, and key executives, the leadership team has to be sufficiently knowledgeable about cybersecurity to make sure that they're asking the right questions, of ensuring that patches are done and the right protocols from a governance perspective are in place, as well as the technological challenges.
Yeah, I would just add to that, that cybersecurity is everybody's responsibility, all across the organization, from the top where the tone gets set down to the last person, because the organization is only as strong as its weakest link. And so there are all kinds of ways to enter into an organization and create mayhem. This is not sort of a one and done kind of thing. So you wake up every morning and you have to check the vulnerabilities, and these people are very creative and they have strong incentives to go after your data, your money, your business, and to be disruptive if they're bad actors from nation states. And so you just have to be constantly working at this. And then from a firm's perspective, I teach risk management. And, it just seems to me that this preparing for cyber risk is part of overall enterprise risk. And it has to be woven into that program as a real, pillar for thinking about managing risk. You can't treat it as something separate. Everybody has to do it. Sound good?
Yep, I completely agree. It has to be part of an enterprise risk approach and strategy. And it's also important to look at what currently exists in the organization in terms of business continuity and resilience, because a lot of that can help inform cybersecurity response and the other way around as part of a cohesive risk management strategy.
Right. Well, Judy, this has been really great. And I'm sure we have a lot more to learn about these issues, but thanks for taking the time today and educating us about cybersecurity, resilience, and the problems that we're having. They're not going away, and we need to be continually attentive to them.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.